When I first saw this presentation that I had to do in the technical presentations, it said any technical presentations. I saw that there was constantly the subject of innovation coming up. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about innovation and what it means, and we're going to look at some examples, and we're going to see why it's really good to be mindful about innovation. And I want to show you an invention that I found on this site, totallyabsurd.com. It's called the dog watch. And what it does is it gives you the time in doggy years. So it takes every minute and every second and every hour and multiplies it by 7 so you can see what doggy time is. So, and this is a real invention. It's got a patent, so if you want to get it for somebody on your list, it's there. But the question that I have for you is, do you think this is an innovation? How many people think this is an innovation? Well, it's a trick question, because it depends on your definition of innovation. So if you do a Google search for innovation, you get a long list of definitions. And usually when you do a search for definition, you get a dictionary definition. And so the first item you get, at least the one that I got, was a Webster's Dictionary definition of innovation, a new idea, device, or method. And so according to that definition, the dog watch is an innovation. But remember, that search had a lot of results, and there were a lot of different results. One of them was from this fellow, Clayton Christensen. And he has become sort of an authority on the whole concept of innovation. And he goes into really deep discussion of what innovation is, and he has this theory called disruptive innovation, which involves big businesses and small businesses and how small businesses have an advantage when it comes to innovation. And then there are other people, CEOs in the business world, and they all say, no, that definition that you first saw is way too simple for innovation. And one of the arguments that they give is the automobile. In the late 1800s, the first automobile was invented, but it was way too expensive for anybody to afford it, and so nobody ever used it. It wasn't until the early 1900s when Henry Ford used another innovation, the assembly line, to make it less expensive enough so that people could use it, and actually started filling a need in society. And so these fellows say that that's what an innovation is. It's not just an idea, but it's an idea that fills the need in society and is actually absorbed into society. And so if we take a look at some examples of early innovations, we have on the left a list of innovations, and on the right we have the adoption times approximate. We see that the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, domestic horse, compass, all of these things have one thing in common, and that is early adopters would have an advantage over late adopters. That's pretty standard, right? So take, for example, the Bronze Age. If you lived back in the Bronze Age and you were in a society that was a late adopter and hadn't really started making bronze instruments, and perhaps maybe you're a soldier, you're keeping guard outside of your community, and you look in the distance and this fellow comes walking toward you, and here you are with your stone axe and your wood shield, and he's got his bronze axe and his bronze shield and maybe a helmet and some armor. What are you going to be thinking? You're going to say, oh, you are at a disadvantage, right? And that principle applies to pretty much all major innovations. If you are a late adopter, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And so if we take that list that we saw before and we put it side by side with a list of innovations that are more recent or more current, take a look at the adoption times. You see on the left, some of those adoption times, the Bronze Age, centuries long, a dozen centuries. Whereas on the right, these more recent innovations, just maybe 1 or 2 centuries long, right? So what does that tell us about innovation? As we get closer to the current time, the adoption time gets smaller, right? And what else can we kind of learn from this? Because of technology and because of population increases and communication is getting better, the number of innovations seem to be increasing, right? So here on the list we have all these innovations, major innovations, and yet just in 2 centuries. Whereas the ones on the left, they span many, many centuries. So those are 3 things we just talked about. We talked about the advantage of being an early adopter. We talked about how adoption time gets smaller as you get close to the present. And we talked about the number of innovations per century increase as you get closer to the present. And one other thing that we want to keep in mind is the idea of risk. So we already talked about how it's risky if you're a late adopter of an innovation, right? Also, it's risky if you want to adopt an innovation, you might have to abandon another innovation that you've already invested in. And people are reluctant to do that, right? So that's a risk that you're going to take. And then thirdly, if you invest in something that is not really a good innovation, or maybe it's just not developed yet, you're running the risk of investing in something that's not really going to benefit you. And here are some examples: Betamax, AOL, Napster. These are things that people may have invested in the past and regretted it because it turned out that these weren't really innovations that were going to help them, right? So 4 things. Early adopters have advantage. Adoption times are decreasing as we're getting close to the present. Number of innovations are increasing as we get closer to the present. And risk. Those 4 things really are driving home the message that it's really beneficial to us to be mindful about innovation. Not to let it just kind of float in the background, but really make an effort to be aware and mindful about innovation. So I just kind of jotted down a couple of innovations that seem to be going on these days. And there's a lot of them. And this is just a partial list. You could probably add to this list some innovations that come to your mind. And it might seem overwhelming. It's like, wow, look at all this. This is like data overload. So how can we go about trying to be mindful of innovation without getting stressed out or overwhelmed? Well, there's some suggestions. And the first is, if you are mindful about innovation, if you know that it's important to be mindful about innovation, you're already ahead of the curve. But some other recommendations might be, have you ever heard of SMART goals? SMART goals are a technique that really help to make your goals more successful. So it's specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. If you can make goals that are all those things, you're more likely going to achieve those goals. So if we could work these SMART goals into our desire to learn more about innovation, we might be more successful, right? Of course, time. Everybody is short on time, but if you can carve out time, if it's on the train, if it's maybe during coffee in the morning or late at night, just fit somewhere in your schedule to look into innovation, whatever innovation is of interest to you. And hopefully that way we can be mindful about innovation. Leverage technology. The same technology that's increasing the number of innovations is also helping us to be mindful of innovation. So there's social media, there's podcasts, there's RSS feeds, and newsletters. What I find is really impressive is YouTube. You can find a YouTube video on almost anything. It's like, wow, I wonder how I can fit the screw into the side of this vacuum. And there's somebody on YouTube who has that same problem, and he's telling you exactly how to do it. So social media is an excellent way to leverage technology to be more mindful of innovation. And then finally, network. Discuss with other people what it is that you're looking into, and ask them, what are they looking into? And perhaps even here at Toastmasters, it could be a topic for discussion for a presentation. Pick an innovation that you think would be helpful for the group, or you're just curious about, and make that one of your presentations. Or at work, you can talk to your manager and say, hey, I'd like to talk about this with the team. What do you think? Or what would you like for me to talk about with the team? And then this way, you can network and encourage one another to be mindful about innovation. So I wanted to share an experience that I had that really is helpful. It was helpful for me to appreciate how it's important to be mindful about innovation. I went to school for commercial art, and back then, nobody had personal computers. And so when you went to school for commercial art, there was X-Acto knives and rapidographs and T-squares, and that's how the advertising industry worked. It was mostly print. And eventually, all of a sudden you started seeing these personal computers in the office. And coming from sort of the art field, I was reluctant. I didn't want to have to do the computer thing, because that's not really true art. But I realized I had to make the change. I had to make the investment into learning how to do things on the computer. And I'm glad that I did, because there are no print industries that use typesetting with galleys of text or anything like that anymore. And I would have been in pretty big trouble if I had stayed there, right? And so years went by, and suddenly I'm finding that the web is exploding. Wow, I better get out of print and start getting into the web. And so moving over towards the internet and the web was a good move, because later on there weren't many print jobs left. So that happens over and over again, and it's a really good thing to keep in mind. I'm sure you have examples as well where things happen and you may have to make the change and invest in some kind of innovation. So good examples to keep in mind whenever you're struggling. Do I really want to research this innovation? Yes, you really do. You want to make time to be mindful of innovation. So thank you very much.